Ladies and gentlemen, what's going on, and welcome to Divers Ready. My name's James. It is so great to see all of your smiling faces, and welcome to this, the next in our series of videos that we call Quick Tips. The Quick Tips series, if you're not familiar, is where I try and cram as much of my scuba diving knowledge into a video, 5 minutes or less, and normally fail. They normally run over, but I do my best. This week we're talking SPGs. I'm going to tell you how an SPG is made, how it works. I'm going to talk to you about some of the options you've got when selecting a submersible pressure gauge, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the common failure points with SPGs and how you can make your gauges last longer. So, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to smash that little bell icon, 2021 style, and that way you never miss any of our future content. We're going to head over to the workbench and I'm going to break it down for you. I've got a whole bunch of submersible pressure gauges, or SPGs, here in different shapes and sizes we're going to take a look at. First and foremost, let's look at the basic construction. So you have a high pressure hose. This one is test rated to 5,000 psi, which is a lot higher pressure than the working pressure of any normal scuba cylinder. So it's meant to endure high pressure. It's a specific hose for the job. The end that connects to the first stage of your regulator has a normally a 5/8 or a 9/16 screw attachment. It has the O-ring there, and then the actual hole that the gas passes through to feed the gauge is incredibly small. I'll take a close-up shot of that, but it's really just a pinprick to give you an idea of how thin the pipe is on the inside of the high-pressure hose. The hoses swivel. They swivel so you can turn them and see them in different angles and different directions, and they achieve that by use of this little spool here. So this spool is basically has a O-ring on each end of it, and that sits in the seat of the hose and in the end of the gauge itself, essentially something just like that, and it forms a seal on both ends while allowing the gauge to rotate. So this is a wear and tear item, and we'll be talking about that in just a moment's time. And then you have the gauge itself. Brass housing, tempered glass on the face, you have a plate and an indicating needle, and then on the back of these you have the actual bourdon tube, which when pressurized activates the needle and actually moves it. So how that works is it's basically a copper pipe that is flexible, sealed at both ends. So the pressure enters the gauge, and as the pressure increases, that copper pipe attempts to straighten. On the other end of that copper pipe is a mechanism which is attached to the needle, which causes the needle to move. So as the pressure increases, it straightens. As the pressure decreases, it goes back up again, kind of like the way those party blowers, you get the idea. It's the same exact function, and that therefore translates to a scale on the gauge and indicates how much pressure you have in your cylinder. So that's the very basics of that. The bourdon tube is named after a French watchmaker, by the way, Eugene Bourdon. There you go. So let's talk a little bit about the differences in these gauges and what you can look for when selecting a submersible pressure gauge. Starting with, obviously, units. Do you want imperial or metric? Here I have one in imperial, PSI, 3000 for a full tank at Al 80, and here I have one in bar, which would be 214 bar for 3000 PSI. Some gauges you can find, it's less common these days, but you can find that have both of them. Next thing you will probably want to decide when you're choosing an SPG is, do you want a simple setup like this one is, just brass and glass, or do you want one that comes in a housing commonly referred to as a boot? I took this gauge off of my wife's regulator. This is an Apex SPG basic thing, and it just comes in a rubber boot and housing, and you can attach a clip to the end of it. Fantastic, all that good stuff. I don't really like boots. Boots hide problems. If you've got a leak coming from here, yeah, sure, it's going to come out of the housing eventually, but I much prefer a nice, simple brass and glass, where if there's anything going on, if there's any corrosion or leaking, I can see it straight away and get on the maintenance. These things tend to hide problems, hide issues a little bit, hide corrosion, and they're unnecessary. You can also decide what color face you would like on your gauges. They come in whites, they come in black, they come in random colors like this. All the faces or the numbers they're on should be luminous. Generally, the black face gauges I use for technical diving and overhead environments because I find them easier to see in low light situations. The numbers here still glow in the dark, so I hit that with my torch, kind of charge the luminescence up, and then all dive I can see my numbers nice and clearly. in the same way that when they were setting out imperial gauges for aviation, they made the faces dark and the numbers bright because they were easier to see for pilots at night. Next then, you're going to want to decide how long you want your high pressure hose to be, and that's going to be relative to the length of your body, because your hose is connected on one end to your first stage. On the other end, you want to be clipping it off onto a D-ring. You don't want your hose hanging out, dangling in the water, creating drag, getting caught on things. That's not a good idea. So the distance between where you mount the bolt snap and how far your first stage will be relative to your body length. So just basically pick a hose length that's going to be comfortable, but not give you so much excess hose that it's looping out in the water column and creating drag. Now, on the subject of boots, let's talk about consoles for a bit. Consoles are basically where they give you a pressure gauge, probably an analog one, and then they'll either mount a puck style computer, or you have like an additional depth gauge, and then on top of that an additional compass, or on the backside you have a compass. I don't like those anymore. It's 2021. We have dive computers. We have dive computers on our wrist most of the time. We're not using tables anymore. There's really no need to be using an analog depth gauge. I know some people are going to disagree with me on that. It's my personal preference. I don't like analog depth gauges. I just want one simple gauge which tells me the most important information, which is how much gas do I have left. I trust my dive computer to tell my depth. Let's move on quickly then and talk about problems with gauges. Starting with the gauge itself. The gauge is a wear and tear item. That board-on tube that expands and contracts and expands and contracts as the pressure is on and gets lower and so on is a wear and tear item. And eventually, and I have a broken one here to show you, the gauge is going to start to read high. So as you can see, this is not connected to a scuba cylinder, and yet the gauge is reading 10 bar. That's not good. You don't want to be in that situation. So that's pretty much garbage. You can't do anything about that. It's not worth trying to fix the board-on tube inside the gauge. Throw it away, buy a new gauge. But there are a couple of other considerations. Obviously, make sure that your hoses have no abrasions, they're not left in direct sunlight, and they're not kinked or pinched in any way, shape or form. And then remember that you have 3 O-rings, and it's worth carrying a spare for each of those. You have 2 of the same size, tiny little O-rings on each side of the spool, and you have an O-ring at the end of your high pressure hose where it connects to your first stage. So it's worth keeping spare O-rings for each of those so you can change them out if you see a leak happening. Remember, this is high pressure, so if you have a leak, things can go from, oh, tiny little bubbles to great big explosion and catastrophic gas loss really, really quickly. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Let me know in the comments below if there's any advice you've got regarding SPGs that I missed. One of the things I love about this community is that we're all here sharing knowledge in a good, positive, friendly way, and I thank you for that. Thanks so much for watching as always. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so already. And until next time, my name's James. This was your Divers Ready Quick Tips video for this week. Dive safe, dive often.